In this video, I'll be showing you how I make my bud vases. Typically, these are bellied forms with a slender neck and a very narrow opening to hold one single stem and flower upright. As those of you who followed my work for long enough will know, I generally don't make rounded vase forms. Instead, my pots tend to be cylindrical with straight sides and sharp edges. And whilst I do love more traditional bellied bud vase forms, they wouldn't really match the style that I've cultivated over all these years, so instead I keep them as simple as can be, with a perhaps slightly unorthodox opening which slopes down and inward. For each of these I use about 300 grams of a high iron stoneware clay body. It comes in these orange bags, which I always fold up, push the air out of and stack away somewhere. There's no real reason to keep them, but I sort of like the idea of being able to look back on all of them to see just how many bags of clay I've used over the years. Once all the clay has been weighed out, I give each one a quick wedge, and this is really just to combine and amalgamate all the weighed out pieces. The clay that comes fresh from the bag is generally in pretty good condition. Usually there aren't any air pockets or any harder spots, so I can use it pretty much immediately without wedging it. But if I do use reclaim, or if I happen to mix reclaim into fresh new clay, which I do quite often, then it will need a really good wedge. Once all wedged up, I wrap them in plastic and bring them all over to my throwing wheel. In the drafty studio, the outsides of these lumps of clay will dry out quickly, resulting in each ball of clay having a sort of harder shell around softer clay inside, so keeping them wrapped up in plastic as I work helps to prevent that. These ware boards to my right are where I'll place the thrown pieces. When I begin throwing, I pull them back all the way like so. That way I can easily position the thrown pots on the end of the board without stretching too far. And then, as the board fills up, I progressively push the board further forward. This way I'm never stretching too much, and it means I don't have to get up constantly to place down the pots. It's just one of those things I do to help streamline my throwing process. So, let's get started. I firmly throw the ball of clay onto a thin skim of clay that's left over from the previous pot when you slice it off the wheel. As long as this skim of clay is dry, relatively, it'll help the ball stick really firmly onto the wheel head. These first movements are the centering of the clay. It's a process where I apply both downward pressure and sideways pressure until I feel like the lump of clay runs completely smoothly beneath my hands and is perfectly centered. Only then will I begin to open up the lump and form the internal base of the pot, which for these I want to be about 3 to 4 millimeters thick. The next step is to bring up the walls, and essentially all I'm doing is pinching the thicker clay down at the bottom and then very gradually pulling it up towards my throwing pointer, which for these pots is really only there as a rough guide, as I don't mind if these pots alter in height, as ultimately I sell them in sets of 3, and a little variation between them makes the sets of bud vases feel more individual. When throwing these, I purposefully leave the upper section of the wall and the rim thicker than I might do otherwise. I do this because when it comes to folding the clay inward at the top to form the downward sloping rim, if there's too little clay in the upper walls, there's a good chance they'll just flop inward uncontrollably, especially where the sharp angle is made. So by leaving myself excess material to work with, it keeps that section of the pot stronger. But essentially, all I'm doing for these is throwing a cylinder that's slightly taller than needs be, and then once I'm happy with the approximate height, I'll fold the upper section inward. But first, it's important to get all the water that's accumulated inside the pot out, as once the piece is partly enclosed, it can be really difficult to remove it. I then scrape away some of the excess clay around the base, and then offer up my metal kidney and firmly push the clay outward to meet the metal edge. I will be getting more water and slip on the outside again when it comes to folding in and forming the opening, but I feel as if removing the slip at this stage helps to add stability for the next few steps. I then wet the upper portion of the pot, and I gently collar it inward. It's at this point that you'll know whether your clay has been really well wedged or centered, as if it hasn't, the clay will very easily just buckle, or an undulation in the rim might form. Then once that thicker portion has been folded over, I can begin to throw it to be thinner and form the narrow opening. I then quickly clean up the outside if it needs it, and then very carefully, using the sharp edge of my metal kidney, I push this portion of the pot downward until it slopes inward slightly. This usually also has the effect of creating a slight bulge just beneath the top of the pot. So again I go back to the outside and I push that back in. These tend to be pieces with quite a few back and forth motions, where fixing one part affects the other, so it can be quite a fuss to get it just right. But I suppose ultimately, for myself anyway, it doesn't matter if they're a tiny bit rough at this stage, as the day after, once these pieces are leather hard, that's when I'll trim them and neaten them up thoroughly, and thus there's no point in getting them absolutely perfect at this stage. I then give that sharp edge a quick chamois, and then I slide a twisted wire underneath the pot to separate it from the wheel head, and then with dry hands I can gently clasp around it and lift it away. And then, once the board is completely filled up, I can take it and set it aside overnight, and then usually the following morning they should be more or less leather hard and ready to trim, refine and finish. Once leather hard, I can pick these pots back up and place them on the wheel. If I were to try and do the same thing when they are freshly thrown, I would just destroy them. They need this time for some of the moisture to leave the vessel so that they can be trimmed, and it isn't really a process that you should rush, as doing so can cause the pots to crack. To attach them onto the wheel, I brush some slip onto the base and then rub the pot firmly in place until it's dead centre in the middle of the wheel. I also use a rubber kidney just to press in a tiny portion of the clay against the metal, creating an additional seal to hold the pot firmly down. Then the trimming can begin, and for these, I really try to get them as thin as physically possible, as when these are glazed, it can be difficult to remove all of the excess glaze from the internal cavity, which can add quite a bit of weight back onto the piece. I very firmly hold the trimming tool and skim perhaps 2 or 3 mil away from the outside, and it's worth noting that all of the clay removed during this process can be recycled and reused. Once I finish trimming with my bison turning tool, I'll then just skim over the outside surface with a straight-edged metal tool. This removes any faint chattering and creates a surface that's just a bit smoother and more even. Next, I can move on to trimming the top, which I use a curved trimming tool to do. And as I do this, I try to be quite careful and not let many trimming pieces fall inside the form, which means as I work, I usually try to position one finger in the opening, just to prevent any larger pieces from going inside. I then use the curved edge of a metal kidney just to smooth over and neaten the inward sloping rim, and then I spend a moment or two just tidying up that sharp edge, be it with this tiny trimming tool or just the pads of my fingers. I want it to be sharp, as once the pot has been coated in glaze and fired, it'll cut through my glazes quite nicely, revealing the rich warm colour of the iron-bearing clay underneath. I then scrape away the excess at the bottom and then tuck the tip of the knife underneath the pot. I then clean the wheel head, just so no burrs of clay stick onto the rim of the vessel, tap centre it into place, and then secure it down with 3 soft lumps of clay, which I push quite carefully into place. As the walls of the pot are so thin, I push the clay down against the wheel head, letting the excess push against the pot itself, rather than pushing the clay directly against the pot, which could create a slight indent in the walls. I then place my spinner on top, which allows me to apply downward pressure that's distributed across the whole base, rather than being focused in one place, like it might be if I use my fingertips. This can be especially useful when you're trimming a pot that has a very thin base. I then take a smaller trimming tool to turn a beveled edge on the bottom, and then I trim over and remove the wiring off marks that are left on the very bottom of the piece. The beveled edge helps to remove a vulnerability that would exist on the pot had it just been a sharp right angle around the base, as a sharp angle like that on the bottom would be really prone to chipping as the pot is banged against tables and surfaces. I then use the smooth side of a metal kidney just to burnish the clay, which forces in any exposed specks of sand back into the clay body and generally makes for a cleaner surface overall. And lastly, I take my maker's mark, which I carved myself from a block of porcelain, and push it into the base of the pot. This is my identifying mark. It's how people can recognise the pots which I've made. It's a simple mark, which I guess is in line with my overall aesthetic too. I want it to be readable and not too complicated, and I like that once fired, it's not too obvious. Trimming is one of those tasks where it's all about catching the clay at the right stage. If it's too soft, you won't be able to remove as much material, and there's a good chance that the piece will be deformed during the process, or at least you'll have to be far more careful when working, to a point where it's actually counterproductive. And if the clay is too firm, it can have the same effect, as you'll end up having to apply far more pressure with the tool, removing less material as you go, which makes the process take longer, and it can result in you actually hurting your wrists due to the amount of pressure that's needed to remove the clay, which is also why having very sharp trimming tools really does help. All that being said, catching the clay at that perfect moment can be a challenge in itself, and a skill that's acquired over time, knowing how best to monitor your pots, when to flip them over so that the bases can dry, and how to leave them overnight without the pots becoming too dry. There's a lot to consider, and it definitely takes forgetting about a board of pots and then becoming far too dry to work with, and having to trash and recycle all of them. I'm sure that's happened to every potter at some point. It doesn't take too long though to trim each one of these, and if it is a particularly hot day, as I'm turning, I'll keep those on the board waiting to be trimmed, covered in plastic sheeting, just to ensure that all the pots are at the perfect stage when it comes to actually turning them. Hereafter, I'll let these pots turn completely bone dry, which again, depending on the weather and the studio itself, can take either a day or up to a week. But once they are fully bone dry, I can pack them into my electric kiln to be bisque fired. This changes what is clay into ceramic, a material that's much harder and is now absorbent. I do these firings overnight when the electricity rates are cheaper and the kiln goes to about 1000 degrees centigrade. And as you can see, these bud vases always stack really nicely into my mug forms. Once the kiln is totally packed, I check to make sure that the lid won't crush anything when placed down, and then it can be closed up and the firing program started. 48 hours later, once it's cooled down enough, I can unpack the kiln. The pots still are fragile at this point, but they have much more strength now as compared to when they were bone dry previously. They can still chip easily, so you do still need to be very careful when handling this kind of work, especially if the pieces are thinly trimmed and have sharp edges. Once unpacked, the next stage is waxing, which needs to be done to the base of every single piece and to the lids and galleries of any lidded vessel. I tap center the bud vase upside down and brush on a thin layer of wax emulsion and quickly dab a little extra into my maker's mark, just to make sure that it's absolutely sealed, as cleaning glaze out of that little indent can be quite troublesome. Essentially though, this wax just acts as a simple wax resist and prevents the glaze from adhering to the base, which is important, as if they were covered in glaze, they would just stick to the kiln shelf during the firing, which would destroy the pot, and possibly the kiln shelf too, which are quite expensive. To make my emulsion brush on a little better, I just water it down with some boiling water and give it a good mix, but equally you can use molten beeswax and paraffin wax too. Now these pots are ready to be glazed, and this next sequence of footage will show how I mix my glaze and then sieve it, ready for use. In layman's terms, glaze is just a mixture of raw materials which are suspended in water. There are vast amounts of different glazes, and they can change depending on the type of clay you're using, whether it's terracotta, stoneware, or porcelain, and then it can also depend on which type of kiln you're using, be it electric, gas, soda-fired, wood-fired, or salt-fired. And then lastly, it can also depend on what temperature you're firing to. But essentially, glazes are generally made up of three things, which is alumina, flux, and silica. And then there are things you can add which modify that, like colorants and opacifiers, which change the glaze's nature altogether. The kiln too, in certain situations, also has a say on how your glazes will eventually look. So in this instance, I'm using a feldspathic crackle glaze with red iron oxide acting as the colorant. If this particular mix was fired in an electric kiln that contains ample oxygen, you would end up with a sort of putrid yellow colour. But if you take this same glaze recipe and fire it in a reduction atmosphere in a gas kiln, like I have, you end up with lots of pleasant green hues which have lots of depth and iron speckling due to the reduction process. But to mix up these glazes themselves, I just mix the raw materials into water. I then churn it all up into a smoother solution with my 5-gallon glaze mixer, and then I sieve this solution, which is what I'm doing now, through an 80 mesh sieve. And then I make sure that the mixture is at the right viscosity. You don't want it to be too thin, otherwise it won't coat the pots in a layer that's thick enough. And if it's too thick, the glaze can actually end up cracking and splitting and flaking off the pot, even before you fired it. So finding what works best for you, for your particular clay and glazes and firing method, usually takes some trial and error. This certainly isn't a process where one size fits all. With glazing, there's literally an infinite amount of variability, and truthfully, I wish I was more of a chemist, so that I'd understand some of the more fine and complex details. But I learn as I go, and I think really I'm a potter that prefers the actual making side of things, as opposed to the glaze chemistry side of things. One thing that always used to shock my students when I taught evening classes at Maze Hill Pottery is how unsimilar glazes can look at this stage as compared to once fired in the kiln. This red will change into a dark green, and there are pink glazes that turn into blues, so don't take what you see at this stage to relate to how they'll look once fired, as they'll usually be totally different. Once the glaze is ready to go and is mixed thoroughly, I take the bud vase, grasp it with a pair of tongs, and submerge it into the glaze. I let most of the excess drain out, and then I double dip the rim. The piece is then carefully set aside, and I won't touch it again until the glazed surface and the pot itself has totally dried out. Care needs to be taken too, with how much pressure you apply with the tongs themselves. It's very easy to grasp too firmly, which can result in the pot exploding, sending shards all over the place and into the glaze. This white glaze is virtually the same as the red one you saw previously. It simply doesn't contain any red iron oxide, and therefore it'll fire a sort of grey-white colour. This clip clearly shows how the glaze simply flows off the waxed area, although often some beads of glaze do settle onto the wax, which will need to be cleaned up later on. Like previously mentioned, this cleanup is only something I do when the pot is completely dried out. When freshly dipped, the glazed surface is quite tacky and soft, and cleaning the pot up immediately can be really difficult. In fact, you often just make it worse. So instead, and again depending on the weather, I wait a number of days before attempting any cleanup, and all I'm doing is fettling over the more obvious drip marks. It's also at this stage that I rub over the tong marks that were used to grasp the pot and submerge it in glaze. This whole process, the cleanup of a pot, is really important, again depending on what types of glaze you use, but for these ones, the more care and attention I give the pots now, the better they'll look once fired. And once all the glaze itself has been gone over and double checked, then I can move on to cleaning up the base, which I just do with a damp sponge. I remove those settled beads of glaze, and I also make sure that the line between where glaze and clay meet is as clean and as straight a line as possible. Fundamentally, I'm creating pots that are quite well finished and very simple, and if these glazes themselves were left to be quite messy and unkempt, it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't look right. Whereas say with wood-fired pots or soda-fired pots, you can often get away with being a little bit untidy and crude, as the way the pots fire in the kiln makes such a vast impact on how they'll look ultimately, and even if you did finish them very carefully, the firing and the accumulating wood ash that melts over all the pots can change them far beyond recognition. Whereas the gas firings I do won't create such drastic and random changes. In fact, it can be quite sterile in comparison. You'll notice beneath the pot I'm working on, there's a basin of water. This collects all the excess glaze that falls into it, and eventually I can sieve that back into my larger buckets of glaze, so again, very little is wasted. Once all the pots have been glazed and cleaned up, they can be packed, layer by layer, into my Rohde gas kiln. It has a capacity of 340 litres, which is 12 cubic foot. And once fully packed, the firing can begin. Usually very early the next morning, I switch on the gas and ignite each of the 4 burners, making sure that the door of the kiln is open during the lighting process. That way there's no risk of gas accumulating in a closed chamber and then being ignited, which can and does lead to explosions and injury. Once ignited and the doors are closed, I very gradually, over about 5 hours, take the kiln up to 860 degrees Celsius. This is the point where I initiate reduction, and this is also what's responsible for the green hues in my glazes. The whole reason that I own a gas kiln is that it opens up the possibility of firing in a reduction atmosphere, which is something that's just not quite possible to do in a conventional electric pottery kiln. Once the kiln's temperature reaches 860 degrees Celsius, I initiate reduction. I do this by sliding the dampers over the flues of the kiln to be half closed. I also drastically increase the gas pressure and the air pressure. This causes the fuel that's burning inside the chamber to burn inefficiently, as there simply isn't enough oxygen inside. This is why flames start to emanate from the flues, as you can see here, and out of the spy holes in the door too. So instead of being able to find oxygen in the chamber itself, it reaches inside the clay and glaze of the pots themselves, stripping away an oxygen molecule from an iron molecule, which then changes the colour into the green hue, which you'll see at the end. Throughout the entire firing, I keep quite fastidious notes. That way, I can replicate good firings time and time again by simply following the charts from the previous ones. As the firing progresses towards the end, which is about 1290 degrees Celsius, the chamber inside begins to become white hot. There are spy holes in the kiln's door I can peek in during the firing, and through these I can observe the pyrometric cones. These melt and slowly bend over at very specific temperatures, and once all the cones are at the right position, touching toes, I can call it a day and switch off the kiln. And for the potters watching, I fire to about cone 10. Thereafter the kiln is turned off, and after crash cooling it to 1000 degrees centigrade, I completely clam it up by closing the dampers and the spy holes in the door. About a day and a half later, once the kiln's internal temperature is about 150 degrees or so, I can open it. I'm always anxious to see inside, to make sure that everything has fired correctly. The tinkling noise you can hear is the sound the pots create as the glazes contract slightly around them. This cacophony doesn't last long, although some pots I have at home, especially Timecodes vessels for some reason, arbitrarily let out one single loud ring as tension in the glaze surface is released, and this can happen even years after the pot has been fired. I carefully remove the kiln shelves and the pots, as they're still very hot to the touch, hence the protective gloves. Each pot is checked over, and somewhere within all these vessels is some of the simple cylindrical bud vases. Although simply unpacking them isn't quite the final step, the last thing I do for all my pots is very gingerly sand the bottoms, not so much to make them glassy smooth, but just to remove any very coarse specks of sand that are present on the bare clay. And that's it, the process from start to finish. In reality, from beginning to end, this process can take weeks and months, but it's worth it to have tangible objects that you've made and that you can use to drink from and to eat from, or to simply look at or display flowers in. That's all for this week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.